Ethan, you have been in this field for a long time. How do you see the changes in the psychedelic field? How do you see this new psychedelic renaissance?
I mean, I'll tell you, the psychedelic renaissance really got going just as I was stepping down from head of Drug Policy Alliance 7 years ago. And I've just been blown away. I mean, I think the excitement, the dynamism, the amount of money coming into it, the creativity. I mean, I give first and foremost just huge kudos to Rick Doblin. I mean, he started his organization in 1986. So he's like the one person I think about who has been involved in this in an organizational way longer than I was. I mean, I started speaking out in around 87 and didn't start DPA, Lindisman Center, until 94. And then secondly, I think Michael Pollan's book, a person who had a global reputation and millions of followers and readers on his issue writing around food. That was a breakthrough book right there. So I think it's been amazing. When we won the California Marijuana Legalization Initiative in 2016, we did a poll a few weeks later to see if people might be open to the idea of decriminalizing mushrooms or things like that. And barely 30% said yes. So I was stunned when Oregon passed that initiative in 2020, at the same time that they also passed the all-drug decrim initiative that Drug Policy Alliance had put together. And then when Colorado followed that up, so the transformation in public opinion, how fast it's been, even faster than it was on marijuana, I just think it's incredible. And that you now have, that MAPS could hold a conference in Denver with 12,000 people there, taking over the entire conference center of Denver, where even the Uber drivers were like buzzing off the high from the conference. I mean, it's really remarkable.
Some people say we are moving too fast and we can fall into the same trap like in the 60s. Do you think there is a risk of backlash?
Well, I think the concerns about whether the psychedelic renaissance is moving too fast, first of all, you can't really control it, right? I mean, and part of the reason it's moving fast is because the media loves writing about it. Now, it's also true that the media is always looking for a new story. So it's inevitable that the harms of psychedelics, the people dying and getting hurt as a result of psychedelics use, the abuses in the field, the problems, inevitably that's going to get attention. That's going to get a new wave of media attention. There may be some backlash on the legislative side of things. I think it goes with anything that bursts out. You can't really control it. I think, thirdly, this whole movement has learned to some good extent from the experience of what happened in the 60s with Timothy Leary. You're not hearing the tune in, turn on, drop out rhetoric. You're not hearing people being encouraged to all do LSD and go to a rock concert. People are much more conscious of the need to engage in some forms of safety, some forms of harm reduction. So I think that element, whether you're talking about Burning Man, whether you're talking about online, support services for people having a difficult experience, I think that's much more woven into the movement now. So I think we're better protected, but it is inevitable, as it will be the case with cannabis. Inevitably, the pendulum starts to swing back the other way, and a lot of it's going to depend upon the maturity of the people involved in it, the leadership, and then some things you can't control, which is the broader political dynamic.
Ethan, how do you see the role of psychedelics in the larger landscape of drug policy reform?
Well, I think, first of all, because the issue of how to regulate psychedelics is moving forward so quickly, first in Oregon, after the ballot initiative 2020, then in Colorado in 2022, and we'll see what happens with the initiative that's on the ballot in Massachusetts in 2020, this year, 2024. But you also have state legislative proposals popping up in, I think, roughly half the states. And so there's tremendous innovation and creativity in thinking about what needs to be legislated in order to support the research and have the proper sorts of controls. And I think that type of creativity, as has happened before and also now with cannabis, I think are providing models for how we might think about regulating other substances that have a less elevated character. But if you take the opioids, where there's no way to control the illicit supply, and meanwhile, we had 100,000 people dying prematurely in each of the last few years from an overdose fatality, mostly involving opioids, where we need to come up with some form of legal regulation. I think that from an intellectual policy side, I think it's a positive thing, that there will be ideas coming out of the psychedelics regulatory thinking that will apply in those areas. I think that secondly, the fact that cannabis reform and legalization has been so rapidly followed, more rapidly than any of us expected, by progress on psychedelics reform and some elements of decriminalization regulation, I think that creates a feeling of momentum in terms of broader drug policy reform. Now, I think there's still an unfortunate divide where so many people in the psychedelics field are utterly uninterested in the rest of drug policy reform, except maybe the marijuana piece, and where so many people involved in traditional drug policy reform, whether you're talking about harm reduction and overdose, or whether you're talking about arrest and incarceration or racial injustice, kind of look askance or are not participating sufficiently in the broader area of psychedelics reform. But I think that divide has narrowed somewhat. You know, in the early years, psychedelics reform was woven into drug policy reform, but it was a very tiny thing. It was Rick Doblin and MAPS and some folks at Hefter and some of the researchers and some of the underground folks just showing up. Now it's become a huge thing in and of itself. But I think we're moving a little more in the right direction on that stuff as well, so I'm optimistic.
One of the big concerns is that psychedelic treatment is pretty expensive. Do you think that one day people who are less advantaged can also have access to this form of treatment?
Well, look, the major issue with psychedelic treatment, right, it's not the cost of the drug, it's the treatment itself. It's paying for the time put in by the therapist. And the only way to solve that, essentially, is going to be probably by insurance, private insurance and public health insurance. That's going to require corporatization and medicalization almost certainly in order to get insurance companies to buy in and to see that this is a cost-saving thing from their perspective. There's always hopes that philanthropists can fill some of the void, but philanthropy is only going to fill a tiny, tiny portion of this thing. And then, of course, there's always the option. I mean, you know, the fact of the matter is that even as we get MDMA and psilocybin and maybe other drugs approved for various forms of treatment or psychedelic counseling with some expense that may or may not be paid by insurance, that never forecloses the possibility of people doing this in the underground. And when you're doing it in the underground or the gray market, I mean, they still have to pay for the time of the therapist unless it's being gifted or granted, but there are ways to do it in the informal system. Nothing about the legitimization and legalization of the formal system will undermine the ability to do it outside that system. And in some respects, it might even facilitate that happening as well. So it is, of course, an issue. How it might get resolved more broadly, how in fact collectives might form where there's an element of peer counseling for people sitting for one another who have, you know, taken inexpensive courses and learned how to do this properly and then might sit for one another and take turns. I mean, I think there are ways of being innovative even in the underground area of psychedelic counseling.
What would be the optimal regulation for non-medical use of psychedelics?
You know, when it comes to the regulation of non-medically used psychedelics, I don't know what the optimal answer is. I mean, one of the nice things, you know, we call our states in the United States laboratories of democracy as well as laboratories of policy innovation. So I'm eager to see different models emerge. I admire the way that the folks in Colorado have been in close touch with the folks in Oregon and vice versa to see what they need to improve upon, what are the ideas. I'll be curious to see if the Massachusetts initiative emerges, what happens there. I'll be curious if California ultimately passes its psychedelics reform legislation, which got very close recently and may, in fact, pass in the next year or two. I'll be curious to see what they come up with. You know, I'm not a right-wing libertarian. I don't say automatically sell all this stuff over the counter without any restrictions the way we're now selling alcohol, tobacco, or I mean, there's restrictions, but where it's still legally available to adults. But I think we need to come up with different models. You know, whether or not, you know, over the years, people have proposed some kind of test, you know, that you would need to pass, like the way you have to take a test to get your driver's license. So maybe you pass a test to get your psychedelics use license or your other drug use license. You know, long time ago, I suggested the idea that if you allowed a market whereby people could go pick up their drug at a pharmacy and they would not necessarily need a doctor's prescription, but what would pop up would be a screen where you pay, and the pharmacist would not be allowed to give you the substance until you had answered all 10 questions correctly. And you could take the test as many times as you want. But it would be a form of kind of pushing people, incentivizing people to learn what they needed to learn, basic harm reduction information about the safer rather than more risky forms of psychedelic use. So there's room for ideas like that. It also raises a question about whether microdosing might be treated differently than mini-dosing or macrodosing, and whether macrodoses might be dealt with differently. I think there are some substances that are sufficiently powerful, take ayahuasca or certainly ibogaine, where the market for those things in macrodose levels would be fairly small to begin with, so I wouldn't be quite as worried about that. On the other hand, with mushrooms, I always go back to the issue. So what if somebody's growing mushrooms and they could just sell it at a farmer's market, right? Together with the vegetables and the fruit and the cider and the whatever. How bad would that be? What would be required? Farmers markets are not typically regulated all that much. On that level, I don't worry as much. What if it was being mass marketed in supermarkets or other stores? Libertarians argue that when you have things freely available to adults in that way, that the vast majority of consumers take the time to learn what they need to learn and they don't buy the stuff at all, right? You want to avoid people accidentally buying something when they don't know what it is. You want to avoid the problems of people taking too much, which with cannabis is an issue. People can have panic attacks, land up in emergency rooms, but they don't die. I think with psychedelics, the concern is a little greater. Once again, highly unlikely to die, but you may, have a horrific experience that could be traumatic in ways that last for years, if not life. So I think we need to be sensitive, but I don't have an exact model that I say right now, here's the way to do it, and here's the way to do it all across the US or all around the world.
It's not strictly related to psychedelics, but how do you see the backlash against decriminalization in Oregon and in Vancouver? Does it endanger what you have achieved?
Well, I think the backlash, it happened sooner and in a bigger way than expected. And that, I think the backlash, in a way, it got targeted in part at decriminalization, when in fact it was really more targeted at the growing problems around public homelessness and public drug use, which were not being properly handled or adequately handled in key cities like Portland or Vancouver, which had embraced broad all-drug decrim policies. I think most people agree with the idea that people should not be locked up for simple drug use or possession. I think, and that's been true for a while, and I think people are even willing to accept that people in many places, they should not be punished for simple drug use or possession, and not even forced into treatment. They should be provided help. But nobody wants people injecting drugs on the streets or in the park. Nobody wants to see that, right? Nobody wants people who are obviously drug users mugging people, hurting people, stealing from them, doing things like that. I think that's legitimate. And people have a right to have the streets have some level of order. We live in communities, and to say, so now unfortunately, one of the best answers to that problem were things like the overdose prevention centers, what used to be called safe use centers. And unfortunately, that's not been part of the solution in the US. It was also unfortunate that these problems emerged just as the COVID pandemic was ending. And all of a sudden, all the funding that had been piled on to help homeless people and all that and put them in housing, all of a sudden that dried up. And then this was post the whole George Floyd era, where people were attacking police for both legitimate reasons and illegitimate reasons. And the police basically said, the hell with it, we're going to basically stop policing. And we're not going to participate in implementing this decriminalization law effectively. So a whole range of variables came together to create these growing problems around public disorder. And I think the decrim initiative in Oregon and some of the more decrim policies in places like San Francisco and Vancouver really took the hit. It's interesting, of course, that if you look at the overdose levels, people pointed out that in Oregon, the number of overdoses rose more quickly in Oregon in the last 5 years than anywhere else in the country. What they failed to point out was that the second biggest increase in the last 5 years was Oklahoma, which has among the most repressive policies in America. And what they also failed to point out was that even when Oregon increased dramatically, it still was only at the national average of overdose fatalities. West Virginia, Kentucky were at much higher levels as far as I know. So things got lost in translation in terms of what was actually going on.
What would you say? Is the war on drugs still going on in the US, or has it ended, or is the beginning of the end, or where we are?
Well, yes, the war on drugs is still going on. Look, on the one hand, by legalizing marijuana in half the country now, We've essentially cut marijuana arrests by 2/3. Drug testing is no longer really happening in the same degree. People are no longer being punished with all the civil sanctions. Mothers are no longer having their babies taken away at birth because they test for marijuana. I mean, the legalization has resulted in a reduction of millions of cannabis arrests, mostly directed at young men of color around the country. Big success there. On psychedelics, a growing success there. We have reduced the percentage of the prison population that's locked up, prison and jail population, that's locked up on drug charges very significantly. If you look at the overall U.S. prison and jail population, peaking at 2.3 million and now dropping to somewhat under 2 million, I think a large portion of that drop is the reduction in people being incarcerated on drug charges. So we've made a lot of progress. Now that said, the fact remains that there are parts of the country, especially in the South and some of the more conservative parts in the West, where people are still getting arrested for marijuana possession. So that hasn't fully stopped. You know, and at the same time, we see the pulling back on, the progress on decriminalization. And it looks unlikely. All the hopes that the Oregon decrim initiative would be followed by similar initiatives in other states, that's now not going to happen. That's been put off for some years. And of course, we still have these very long sentences for some drug. We have less mandatory minimum drug sentences, but they're still out there. There's still harsh penalties in many states in the country. And finally, we have these problem with fentanyl and the related things where people are so freaked out, understandably, about the relation of fentanyl to overdose fatality, that they're passing new mandatory minimum drug laws, that they're passing these drug-induced homicide laws where somebody who provides a drug that has fentanyl in it that leads to an overdose fatality is being prosecuted for second-degree homicide, even if they did not know fentanyl was in it, even if they were using the drug at the same time, even if it was just giving it to their girlfriend or boyfriend. So you see that old drug war, it never goes away. It still lurks in the background, and with fentanyl, it's reemerging, to the extent that even some of the more progressive Democratic politicians feel the need to support and endorse some of the more punitive laws and proposals that they know don't work, but they feel that the politics are such now that they have no choice.
And finally, how do you see the future of drug policy reform in the U.S.?
Well, the future, I tend to be an optimist, not on every day. I think the marijuana thing, we're going to see the pendulum swinging backward at times, but I do think that victory is locked in. I tend to be a bit ambivalent about the full legalization at the federal level of cannabis. It would solve a lot of problems, but I'm not crazy about the notion of it opening the door for big alcohol, big tobacco, and big consumer good companies coming in. I do think big pharma will come in, but it will come in by the cannabis field by focusing on isolated elements that can be approved through the normal FDA process. So I don't see that as a problem, because that will then be covered by insurance and be able to target specific medical conditions more effectively, possibly, than the whole leaf cannabis. I think psychedelics will continue to move forward as well. Once again, the pendulum will swing back, but will go. I think on the broader drug war, I think we're generally heading more and more in the direction of not locking up people for as long as we did or as frequently as we did. And I think that harm reduction is becoming more and more part of the mainstream in the United States. My biggest fear in some respects is what's going on with tobacco and nicotine. Where I see the growing push to criminalize cigarettes. There are these proposals now which have been endorsed by the White House, not just to ban menthol cigarettes, which there's a public health reason for doing it, but it could lead to a large black market, but even to ban the sale of cigarettes that have any significant amount of nicotine in it. That would be a de facto prohibition. And I can see that level of foolishness resulting 20, 30 years from now in us having a global war on tobacco that begins to mirror and to replicate what we had with the global war on other drugs, where you have criminal laws, mass incarceration, a federal law enforcement agency, the Tobacco Enforcement Administration, TEA going after with all the informants in the wire. All of those things, and with drugs becoming ever more dangerous. So sometimes it bothers me that many of the more progressive-minded allies, and especially politicians who are my allies on cannabis reform, harm reduction, sentencing reform, are the ones taking the lead in opposing tobacco harm reduction. It makes me wonder if they ever actually got the core principle of harm reduction, whether they just came to it because of arguments around racial justice or what have you. So I do worry about that, and it's one reason why I'm putting more and more time and effort, so that I don't go to my deathbed having, been lauded for my role in legalizing marijuana, while meanwhile we have a whole new war on another drug, tobacco, happening in a way, we need a strong, smart public health campaign to discourage smoking as much as possible. And if that means encouraging vaping and other non-combustible alternatives to tobacco, that's what we need to do. But to move towards the criminalizing, whether we're talking about flavored e-cigarettes or the tobacco, the cigarette itself, I think that's the mistake, where sometimes progressive-minded people can join with conservatives in believing that prohibition is the best form of regulation, when in fact prohibition represents the abdication of regulation.